so our deliberation can begin. I want to welcome the chiefs, the proxies, the representatives that are here. And we do have a very full agenda to complete for the day. And I've had one request, and that's to bring the education report forward. And if the chiefs are okay with that, I understand it'll be a short report. There's no resolutions attached, and that there will be an educational conference in the future, right? Okay. So with that, is that okay for day 3? Can we begin with the education report? Okay. I'm seeing agreement. So we'll proceed. I want to call on Chief Batson to take us into the report, and we will proceed from there. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to bring greetings. Good morning, chiefs, grand chiefs, elders, guests. I'm pleased to highlight the activities of the Chiefs Council on Education since its reactivation. So just for your information, the staff of the education program are Lynn Blackbird, she is the Director of Education, Trent Gervais, the Junior Policy Advisor, and Lynn Akeegan, who is the Administrative Assistant. So by way of introduction, the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, Executive Council of Chiefs, and Chiefs Committee on Education are driven by Resolution November 17-05, which called for the revival of the AMC CCOE. The AMC CCOE was directed to work on all regional First Nations education activities, including the Regional Education Funding Formula/Model and a Manitoba First Nations Regional Education Agreement. So those have been the main activities that the CCOE and the staff have been working on since its reactivation. An education directorate was reestablished at the AMC, and on November 15, 2018, Lynn Blackbird was hired as the education director, followed by the hiring of Trent Gervais, education policy advisor, and Linda Akeegan, administrative assistant. This team works to support individual First Nations who are pursuing control of their own education. The AMC Education Secretariat has provided regional policy analysis and advocacy with representation at the local, provincial, and national levels. The main focus in education for the year 2018-19 has been the interim funding formula model and the Manitoba First Nations Regional Education Agreement. Some of the key issues and challenges with the Manitoba Regional Education Agreement. The agreement is the result of Canada's updated co-developed policy and funding approach implemented on April 1st of 2019, and is based on provincial education funding formulas that include certain enhancements to address First Nations specific needs, such as culture and language education. The agreement seeks to create a partnership between Canada and First Nations to develop treaty-based regional and local education agreements that address First Nations educational goals and priorities. The agreement sets out that Canada will provide funding to Manitoba First Nations over a 5-year period to bring the shift towards First Nations control of First Nations education on reserve. Okay, the next issue I will discuss is the interim funding formula/model. Canada will provide sufficient, sustained, and predictable funding to First Nation students who are enrolled in First Nation schools and enrolled in other schools covered by a funding agreement. Canada will annually provide transfer payments through a funding agreement with each First Nation in Manitoba. The transfer payment will be determined in accordance with the methodology of an interim funding formula/model based on provincial approaches with specific adaptations and enhancements to meet the unique needs of First Nation schools and students. The AMC Education Secretariat facilitated the work of the AMC CCOE, which includes liaising with the technical task force on the development of a new First Nations regional education funding formula or model to increase the funding amount beyond provincial comparability. So some of the activities that have happened over the past year: the Manitoba First Nations Education Directors Meeting. Can I get some water? Since November of 2018, AMC Education Directorate have arranged and facilitated meetings for the education directors and First Nations finance departments to gain an insight and provide input into Manitoba First Nations Regional Education Agreement. Thank you. Including workshops regarding the regional interim funding formula with presentations from MF and IRC related to Manitoba First Nations education strategic planning, including a post-secondary strategy, languages revitalization strategy, nursery to grade 12 strategy, high-cost special education, Jordan's Principle strategy, early learning childcare strategy, along with insight into budgeting and potential employee salary scales, benefits, professional development, and the use of language and culture activities in the school. The education directors also requested and were provided with presentations on teacher recruitment and retention from Teach for Canada. The Treaty Commission gave information on their toolkit for use in the schools. The Manitoba Indian Education Association also provided a presentation, as well as specialized services for children and youth. The education directors have provided feedback on these presentations and included future recommendations for other presentations as well. The Chiefs Committee on Education. Resolution March 18-05, a renewed approach to reassert First Nations jurisdiction in education, which calls for a restoration of various responsibilities of the AMC CCOE to direct and oversee regional activities and research on First Nations education that will include ensuring First Nations control of their own education, as well as to inform Canada and the AFN of the position of the Manitoba Chiefs on education. Re-establishment of a technical task force comprised of advisors from existing First Nations education authorities and AMC Secretariat. For your information, the Chiefs Committee on Education includes Chief Lance Roulette, Sandy Bay First Nation, Chief Vera Mitchell, Poplar River First Nation, Chief Karen Batson, Pine Creek First Nation, Chief Craig Alexander, Rosa River Anishinaabe First Nation, Chief Wayne Desjarlais, Ebb and Flow First Nation, Chief David McDougall, St. Teresa Point First Nation, Chief Clarence Easter, Chimawaywan Cree Nation, Chief Murray Clearsky, Wayway-Sakapo First Nation, Chief Glenn Hudson, Peguis First Nation, and Chief Derek Henderson, Saging First Nation, as well as Oniganu Christian Sinclair from Opaskwayak Cree Nation. The CCOE met on June 27, 2019 to review the REA and the legal reviews that were completed. The recommendation was for a representative from Fox Fraser LLP to attend a future Chiefs in Assembly to provide a presentation on the findings of the Manitoba First Nations Regional Education Agreement to the Chiefs, including availability for question. So that will hopefully be scheduled into our next assembly. The CCOE were also informed that the regional interim funding formula/model was found in some instances to have miscalculations and omission errors upon further examination by the First Nations. There was a request from the Technical Task Force to ensure quality assurance for all Manitoba First Nations with completion of an audit on Indigenous Services Canada. The Technical Task Force, AMC, and Indigenous Services Canada have agreed to such an audit/review for accurate calculations and funding amounts for our Manitoba First Nations. The Technical Task Force. The AMC Secretariat has coordinated numerous Technical Task Force meetings to discuss the Manitoba Regional Education Agreement and the interim funding formula/model. It was decided on June 12, 2019 that the Technical Task Force had completed their work on the Manitoba First Nations Regional Education Agreement and requested the CCOE to review with next steps to begin negotiations with Canada. For your information, the Technical Task Force includes Davin Dumas, Fisher River Cree Nation, representing South Cree, Greg Halcrow, Cross Lake Band of Indians, representing North Cree, Chrissy Kershane, Saugeen First Nation, South Ojibwe, Freddie Wood, St. Teresa Point First Nation, North Ojibwe Cree, Carrie Sutherland, Peguis First Nation, South Ojibwe, and Bev Fontaine, Opaskwayak Cree Nation, North Cree. The Technical Task Force also recommended a legal review of the REA, which was completed by Capo Hildebrandt LLP, and also a second review was completed by Fox Fraser LLP. Some considerations for the First Nation Regional Education Agreement are as follows. So these were some of the recommendations that came from that. Clarity of the definitions used in the agreement. Number 2, the prescriptive nature of the agreement and reference to the Manitoba Schools Act, school boards being used when First Nations administer their own schools, Chief and Council. The language in the agreement may affect MFNERC as a whole, given its specific commitment to provide second and third level services to First Nations education in the province. Fourth, the use of the word agents. Fifth, concern regarding parties as signatories to the agreement. Next, reporting requirements. And lastly, Canada has unilateral authority over individual First Nations as opposed to a nation-to-nation approach that includes reciprocal obligations when Canada is in default. The next area is the Regional Funding Formula/Model and Agreement Negotiations Team. Once the Manitoba Regional Education Agreement is finalized, the negotiations team will begin their work. Resolution October 18-01, Regional Funding Formula and Agreement Negotiations Team calls for the Chiefs and Assembly to continue to support the negotiation team with moving forward on a Manitoba First Nations Regional Funding Formula model to seek a funding model that goes beyond just simply provincial comparability and Canada's interim funding model, with regular reporting to all Manitoba First Nations. For your information, the negotiations team includes negotiator and table lead, Dennis Whitebird, Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. The negotiation team includes representatives from the AMC CCOE, Chief David McDougall, Chief Lance Roulette, and alternatives Chief Karen Batson or Chief Vera Mitchell, as well as representatives from Independent First Nations, Chief Glenn Hudson, and 2 representatives from the Technical Task Force, David Dumas and Greg Halcrow. Technical supports include representatives from AMC as needed, Marcel Belfour or Natalie Ballantyne, and representatives from MFNERC as needed, Virginia Arthurson and George Morasti. The elder is representative from the AMC Council of Elders, Florence Painter. In conclusion, the AMC Education Secretariat is committed to providing support and direction to all First Nations of Manitoba with future educational endeavors that strive for a true nation-to-nation relationship. So with that, that is the conclusion of the education report. And I think we are open to questions. We also have Lynn, I think she's around here. So if there's any questions, this will be coming up at the next assembly, as well as a presentation on the agreement as well. So. Yes.
Say the mic.
Sorry, Mike 29.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Karen, for your report. Chief Andrews, God's Lake First Nation. I just don't have a question, but sort of recommendation. I noticed in your report there's not very much representation for remote fly-in communities on these chiefs communities that you mentioned. And there's only one, Poplar River, as representative, but that's why I sit on the Finissim board, because I noticed that discrepancy. There's hardly any representation from the remote fly-in communities. And we know how hard it is for people to try and survive the remoteness of our communities. People down south don't know what's going on within our communities. Just a suggestion, and also I agree with your funding model to go beyond the provincial one that they're trying to get in place. Right now, the region follows the social formula for welfare, and it doesn't work in our communities. You know, the high cost of living in our remote communities, what they're getting for social assistance doesn't allow them to survive properly on good nutritious food and whatnot. You know, what can a single person live on with $300 a month? So we have to move beyond what the region and Canada is trying to give us. You know, the provincial model doesn't work in all First Nations. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, thank you for your comments. I will take note of that. Were you referring to the Chiefs Committee on Education? Because we do have Chief McDougall on that. Were you talking about the technical task force?
Yeah,
okay.
That and the Chiefs Committee as well.
Yeah, so we do have Chief McDougall on the Chiefs Committee on Education. Mike 30.
Good morning. I just want to give thanks for the presentation this morning, but I did want to provide some feedback being involved with this process, and you know, I guess from the outset we do want to look at supporting you know, an agreement going forward. Here's an opportunity over the last probably 50 some years that we have had in terms of opening up education and and the funding agreement, etc. And you know, there has been some concerns expressed regarding the approach being taken. I know our regional education committee does play a role there, and obviously some of the independent First Nations, including Peguis and OCN and Saging, etc. But also with working with MF-NERC, and you know, they are set up to help those communities that don't have their own education authority, but work in conjunction with MF-NERC to deliver those services. I guess in terms of that overall process and the vision of MF-NERC, and you know, I'm not going to knock them. Obviously, there's communities that do need that support, and they're there to provide that, and I think government is working fairly closely with them. But what seems to be happening in this whole process is, and we've stated this many times along the way, as far as First Nations as a right to education and as a right to have our own authority since I think 74 and going back to 76 in terms of having our First Nation right to education delivered in our communities. I think that's the goal of a lot of our communities. A lot of our First Nations want to achieve that, to be able to deliver that through their administration and their First Nation, and they want to pursue that First Nation right to education. But we need more collaboration, I guess, in terms of working with the mandate of MF-NERC and also the independents. We need to be online, I guess, or in line with that overall approach. They're there to help and they're there to deliver services, but at the same time, the mandate should be to help with First Nations having their own authority over time. I know we're the fastest growing demographic, and certainly communities are growing, but it just doesn't seem to be happening that way right now. And I'm concerned about that because we have always had our right to education and delivered the services within our community and managed and administered our secondary and also our post-secondary. And I guess if it's the hope of government to get away from that through MF-NERC, then I'm not going to support that. We've stated that many times, the independents. It's not that we want to look at fighting with MF-NERC, but they need to look at supporting our vision in terms of supporting our right to education and amongst our individual First Nations. You know, we have over 11,000 members and over 1,000 students in our school. Cross Lake, OCN, Saging are, of the same numbers, but we need to look at supporting the independents in terms of their right to education, rather than looking at efficiencies and amalgamating everybody in one melting pot, which seems to be the idea of government. I guess they want to do things more efficient, more effective, get the best bang for their buck, so to speak. Everybody wants to do that, but it's certainly not to look at giving up our right to education to be able to pursue that. They must know that, and I'm stating that because I know some of our leadership in terms of Indigenous Services Canada are here, and I want them to hear that directly, because we've fought so hard to have our own right to education, and that right will remain with our First Nations. We'll never, ever relinquish that. Doesn't matter if you want to set up another First Nation entity to deliver services. We're there to work together with them, I believe, but also that entity must realize our overall aspirations of delivering and managing our own services and our own children going forward, because we seem to have gotten in some conflicting approaches, I guess I'll state that openly during this process, and we need to eliminate that. I know it's up to the First Nations to decide how they want to deliver their education program. It's not for government, it's not for MF-NERC, it's not for anybody to determine that but us. So I just wanted to make that statement. And I guess with respect to, the funding overall, the government does fund immersion programs, French immersion, and with reconciliation happening, supposedly, maybe our bureaucrats from government need to understand that we have an immersion program also with our languages, and looking at trying to implement that, whether it's Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, or whatever it is, in terms of our communities. We need to have that funded also, because this Trudeau government had stated in terms of reconciliation, they support our language and the growth of our languages within our community. And as part of this education process and funding, we need to support that. The French people get it. Why don't we as First Nations in terms of that funding element? And that's something that we're working hard at doing at Peguis, and actually have a review going on right now in terms of being able to reintroduce that, and strengthen that so that language isn't lost within our community. And second level services is another issue. You know, we deliver second level services within our community, and I think I haven't gone through the briefing here, but we need to maintain that within our independents and our communities that have the ability to deliver their own second level services. And I guess in terms of representation, you know, again, we want to work together on this, but these are some of the conflicts that are happening, and I just wanted to make it known at this table, and also make it known to our guests today that this is the approach that should be taken, and that commitment should happen, especially on the delivery of services and our languages today, given the reconciliation commitment that this Trudeau government has made to us as First Nations. So that's all I have to say for now.
Okay. Thank you for your comments, Chief. And there is a resolution coming forward in regards to sort of related to language, and you were talking about the Francophone French immersion. There will be a resolution coming forward for that related to language. So, okay, thanks everyone for your time and attention. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, Chief Batson. I want to call on Grand Chief now to introduce our next speaker.
Tansiu gemaganak nanas kumun ki tom tawi patiga pia yami toa kamamo pia kayami toa pigiu gitona pio wista I ugema witi I wichat Minister Bennett ega kapi piwichi gwa ispia miag son midudi tini pi tagu tituista. Want to introduce Mark Miller. He is the Parliamentary Secretary to Minister Bennett. I'm quite pleased that he's here. He's dedicated time to be here. As I had said to the Assembly yesterday, we had sent out invitations. I had personally gone out and invited all of the leaders of all of the political parties, many of which had given me their verbal commitments that they would be here. And you know who showed up here yesterday, so I want you to take that back to your communities and relay that information to how valued and what importance our communities are to those political parties. And I also want to acknowledge the fact that the Prime Minister was making his efforts to be here. Unfortunately he was busy, but he did send a letter that each and every one of you had received yesterday. So I want to acknowledge that. I also want to say that I do appreciate the fact that during the past couple of years we have had the pleasure of having our ministers, both Minister Bennett, former Minister Philpott, and Minister O'Regan have come to spend some time with us here at our Assembly. I had asked if Minister Bennett could come, but unfortunately she wasn't able to come. But I'm honored that her colleague and friend Mark could be here. I'll allow him to speak for himself and introduce himself. But I do appreciate that the fact that he is here. I feel that he has been an ally to all of us. He was elected in Montreal, and you would wonder, well, why is somebody from Montreal coming here to speak to people in Manitoba? Is because I have seen that as an individual, he chooses to work for us, all of us, no matter where we are, and I just wanted to, say that publicly and acknowledge him for his efforts in the different ways that he's helped myself and helped ourselves move our issues forward. So I'll say some nice things now, but after you talk, I'll rough you up. So So without further ado, my chiefs, thank you very much for being here, and we'll hear from our guest. You say, Mark.
Hello, Puzo, bonjour, Tanse, Nitizini Ikaso, Mark Miller. If you think my Cree stinks, just wait for the English. I want to acknowledge the Grand Chief for the welcome. I also want to acknowledge Broken Head Ojibwe Nation Chief Deborah Smith for having me here on her land and the land of her people, as well as the chiefs and elders around this table and in this room for the welcome on Treaty 1 territory. It's an honor to be here. It truly is, even though I had to wake up at 4 a.m. to jump on a plane. I'm here on behalf of my colleague and friend, Minister Carolyn Bennett. I am her parliamentary secretary. I am also the member of parliament for downtown Montreal. In French, it's Ville-Marie, le sud-ouest d'Île des Sœurs, but there isn't a single person who identifies as such, so I say downtown Montreal. Minister Bennett couldn't make it here. She did wish to be here. She does send her greetings and her regrets that she couldn't attend, but I am glad to be here. As Parliament broke for the summer, 3 exceedingly important pieces of legislation were passed, first by the Commons and then by the Senate finally. The first 2 the first on Indigenous languages, the second on child and family services, which I'll speak to in a few minutes, and a third finally splitting up formally something that had been as functionally done since we started in government, but as a piece of legislation, as at the end of this year, splitting 2 departments as was recommended in the Royal Commission in 1995, and then nothing was done for over 20 years. And that created 2 departments, Crown Indigenous Services, which I am proud to serve, Crown Indigenous Services, which for which Minister O'Regan is the minister, and his parliamentary secretary, Dan Van Dal, who proudly represents Winnipeg, and then Crown Indigenous Relations, which manages the relations between our peoples, for which I serve under Minister Carolyn Bennett. This, as you all know, and as you've painfully lived through, was a result of a colonial structure and implementing a colonial and paternalistic law, which everyone knows as the Indian Act. It was unable to support and partner with Indigenous peoples based on unique histories, circumstances, and aspirations. As I mentioned, more than 20 years ago, this was recommended by a Royal Commission that came out of a very painful process and extensive consultations, and it was only under this government that we were finally able to achieve it. So the mandate of our department, Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, is to advance self-determination, supporting the implementation, most notably, of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which a lot of you in this room fought very hard for. I live it, but we're already seeing it on the ground, how these 2 new departments are better serving the distinct needs of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. With this change, our government is now able to live up to the Prime Minister's deep commitment to renew this relationship based on respect, cooperation, partnership, and to pursue and to better serve your needs and better support you in implementing self-determination. Enabling legislation to dissolve the antiquated department known as Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, or INAC, as everyone referred it to, came into force, as I mentioned, July 15th, only a couple weeks ago. 1 week later, the order in council was finalized to establish the new ministerial responsibilities under Minister Bennett and for Seamus O'Regan as Minister of Indigenous Services. I mention this because Minister Bennett is now proud to say that she is the last Minister of Indian Affairs. Now, we recognize that policy and legislative changes are necessary to ensure that all future governments recognize Indigenous rights and your right to self-determination. One example of this, as I mentioned I was going to talk about now, is the recently passed Bill C-92, and that the Grand Chief asked that I speak to, which was introduced by Minister O'Regan, dealing with child and family services. Now, I know this act, the process of engagement, met with a number of objections, particularly from a number of people, and very forcefully from other people around in this room. So my appearance here is not to convince you that we were right. Quite the contrary. It is to acknowledge that objection and to speak about the legislation itself and what it intends to achieve. The legislation first and foremost affirms your inherent right to exercise your jurisdiction in relation to the development and delivery of child and family services. As many of you told us in the engagement process, First Nations children and youth deserve to be with their families, their communities, and their loved ones. The staggering statistic that was painful in your minds and is probably ingrained in it is that more children are under care and custody than were ever in the child residential school system. This isn't something that is present and top of mind in non-Indigenous communities, the ones that elect me, and it should be, because the level of pain, the level of separation should be known by non-Indigenous people, and that is one of the struggles of this government, and I would say we have failed to achieve it, is raising that in the awareness of non-Indigenous people that live on this land. Finally, under the Act, Indigenous people will be able to choose their own solutions, your own solutions, for your children and families, and create a better future for generations to come. The Act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families, as it's called formally, opens a door for the hard work done in Manitoba on your Bringing Our Children Home Act. It allows for two options for exercising your jurisdiction over your children and the family services related thereto. The first option, which for many would appear unpalatable, is for an Indigenous governing body, such as yours, with existing legislation to provide notice that they wish to exercise their jurisdiction. In this case, the Indigenous law would not prevail over federal and provincial laws. And now the second option is for an Indigenous governing body to provide notice that they wish to discuss a coordination agreement with Indigenous Services Canada and the province of Manitoba. Once a coordination agreement is in place, then the Indigenous law on child and family service prevails over federal and provincial laws. The federal legislation also establishes three very clear principles to guide the provision of child and family services, no matter who delivers them, in relation to Indigenous children. One, based on the best interests of the child. Two, cultural continuity. And three, substantive equity. Bill C-92 will finally put in law what Indigenous peoples have been asking governments for decades, that your inherent jurisdiction be affirmed so that you can decide what is best for your children, your families, and your communities. By working with and investing in communities through programs like the Nation Rebuilding Program, we are able to better support investments in capacity development and activities that will accelerate the path to self-determination. Now, I mentioned in introduction the two bills that were top of mind and top priority for this government. The first dealing with Indigenous languages, as was mentioned by the Chief earlier, and second, on child and family services, which I've talked about slightly more extensively. What shocks the mind in a lot of people's consciousness when you talk about self-determination, most people think of government and how to reform government structures. What most non-Indigenous communities take for granted is precisely what has been demanded of us: control over children, control and reaffirmation of language, which has been painfully, consciously, and in some cases unconsciously stripped from peoples. This is something that non-Indigenous communities take for granted. I come from a province of Quebec where self-determination has been top of mind. It's been the subject of much debate and of a unity crisis under a good part of my childhood. but no one asked for control over their children. Control over language, yes, but starting from a very strong base. Now, this is something that has been demanded from us, from Indigenous peoples, and that we have taken for granted for way too long. So a lot of the criticism we've received over re-engaging and getting back into communities and talking to people, a lot of these demands have come from consultation tables, however imperfectly they've been constituted, and the conclusions drawn therefrom imperfectly concluded. But they are the profound reflection of demands from society and something that is, by its nature, not a top-down process. And I give much credit to the Prime Minister and Minister Bennett for holding fast to those principles. The Nation Rebuilding Program, for example, which has benefited from a modest budget, was reaffirmed and increased to $20 million for 2019-2020. So this allows communities to go back and think about the nation-building process, which shouldn't be dictated by the federal government. And as the Prime Minister has said, no relationship is more important than our relationship with Indigenous peoples. Now, that is not a catchphrase. It's a deep commitment of this government to a re-engagement process. One of these eye-opening engagement sessions that I've had with a community close to Ottawa is, it's the Grand Chief alluded to it obliquely, is typically the format of an engagement session is you go in and you meet Chief and Council. A lot of the times they beat the stuffing out of you. And then you go back to your team and you go, oh geez, we got it good this time. And that repeats itself. And in one of these engagement sessions, one of the chiefs looked at me and said, we've told you about our frustrations. They're legitimate and you've acknowledged them. But what are your frustrations with us? What are your frustrations with the community? Because if this is going to be an equal relationship, you need to tell us how you're frustrated. And obviously I'm on the spot having to say stuff that might not be palatable to the ears of the people listening. And so being on the spot, I couldn't invent my answer. I told him how profoundly frustrated I was by some of our failures, but also by some of the commitments that we made as a government at the outset that were very, very lofty and set the expectations very high. And early on we were told, slow down, start re-engaging. Don't think in 4-year cycles. Think in longer term cycles and then re-engage. You can't do everything from the top down. And so, when you start thinking that way, you stop looking for electoral victories and you start focusing towards profound change in the community. And so my frustration with the process, as I told the chief, is we need to take the time to get it right. And that isn't about delaying pushing out money. It's about making sure that the process is done right, the engagement is done right, the consultation is done right, and in a lot of circumstances we haven't done it right. And it's important as a government sitting in Ottawa that we acknowledge that. And that's something I think that future governments, getting our house in order, making sure our bureaucrats, I don't push the blame to them, the blame is always ours at top of government, but you're not re-engaging with the same people that you engaged with previous governments, or they're having a different tone. If we say nation to nation, that means the person on the other line is engaging in that process and not dictating. And we haven't done that well enough, and I acknowledge that here today, as I will with other communities. So to conclude, it's together that we'll continue to move forward in the right way, fully engaged and in partnership with you and your communities. Thank you, Chimigwech. Merci.
Chiefs, do we have any questions? Microphone 10.
Okay. Good morning, Chief Mitchell, Poplar River First Nation, and welcome to our region. Yesterday, beginning with this morning, I made a prayer that I wasn't going to insult anybody today, but I lied. So I want to address, I guess, some concerns that have been highlighted, and your comments today has touched on them. My big concern at this point is that, there is current legislation that has been enacted or is going to be enacted that includes Bill C-68, respecting fisheries, Bill C-69, respecting environmental impact, Bill C-91, respecting indigenous languages, and Bill C-92, respecting children and families, and Bill C-98, respecting the Department of INAC and Northern Development, and C-262, respecting the UNDRIP, and Bill C-3, respecting membership. All of these bills have implications on our lands, jurisdiction, and organizations that we all work in. I know that you said that you support Indigenous governments to move forward on self-determination, but it's sad that you didn't get it right, because this legislation is going to be imposed on us whether we like it or not. Imposed, and the implication is that you either jump on a ship or you bail on a ship. And when you bail, we're looked at as radicals. So we have, in Bill C-92, Manitoba has said time and time again, the province has had 30 years to clean up their act, but yet this bill requires the province's permission for us to move forward on our own legislation for CFS. That's what I read in that bill. It's always permission or work in collaboration with the province. We don't want to. We're done doing that already. We're finished. And Bill C-91 in languages, it's fine and dandy to say we have a right to educate our children in their own language, but how can we do that if we're not funded for immersion? I've said time and time again that we've been teaching our language in our schools for over 30 years. And when did any of us ever learn a language by spending 15 minutes every week learning our language? Because that's all we ever get from the government is one instructor to instruct 400 kids, and that's supposed to meet our needs. We inherited that method from INAC when we took over our schools. It's never going to happen. So if the government is really serious about preserving our languages, then our schools need to be funded for immersion. Bill C-98, we commend the amalgamation of Indian Affairs and Northern Development or Health Canada, or whatever those departments are, but they have to work together. And I said that to Minister at the FN. Remind them that they need to work together because they work for the same Indians. Because they're having a culture shock, I think, trying to work together. Bill C-3, S3, it'll enrich our own membership codes, yes. I guess what I'm sharing with you is that we need to be able to address all these implications for all these bills and how we in Manitoba are going to move forward. But we can't do that. If you see the geography in our region, it is pretty difficult to bring 63 First Nations together to review all these bills and what implications they're going to have in our community, in our communities throughout Manitoba. And we need funds to be able to address that, to be able to do the research, the critiques on all the bills, and come up with some recommendations on how we move forward with in Manitoba with all these bills. Do we accept them? Do we reject them? How do we implement them if we don't have the resources to do that? So I'm asking you on the table here to bring to your minister, we need funds to pursue discussions on all these bills. Miguel.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your words. I neglected to mention that Stephen Traynor from Indigenous Services and Michelle Burrows are here with me. So if there are any specific questions from anyone directly on any matters in particular, or which I'm not an expert on, I would defer to them as well, and you're welcome to engage with them at any point. I guess let's start first with Indigenous languages. It's something that I personally fought quite hard for. A lot of my engagement in communities involves going into communities and talking to teachers. I'm in the process of learning Ganyangeha Mohawk, which is the language spoken by the people who were in the land I represent before my people got there, and it's a very difficult language. But I work very hard at it. What it's allowed me to do is to meet people that aren't necessarily, most people in communities have a political view, but they're not elected, or they're just very fierce advocates of their peoples. And so it's allowed me to engage a level of language and what it means to revitalize. I've also, in the process, been able to start learning an exceedingly beautiful language. One of the frustrations I think that's been felt on a number of levels is making sure that, and it's to your point, Chief, about funding. It's very important to affirm what is a human right as embodied in the legislation that we passed, but also the funding models and getting the money to the right people. So the approach that was always envisaged was at two levels, to make sure that first and foremost children, Indigenous children, are learning their languages, and then ensuring that at an adult learner level, you're able to bridge that gap of people whose language who never had the opportunity to learn for various reasons, to have that opportunity. Now, funding was talked about a lot during the consultations that we had with committee and during some of the Senate committee meetings. And the 2019 budget has almost quadrupled what the previous government had in place, which wasn't much, and increased the amount that we announced initially under a failed model, which is the Aboriginal Languages Initiative that needs to be reformed by the independent commission that will be put in place as a result of the new legislation. Hopefully, and this is now increased up to north of 100 million over the next few years per year. It is a significant victory, but is it as much as what is funded to other languages in this country? And people mention French, but I refer also to English in Quebec. The answer to that is no. I will fight personally very hard to get increased funding, but the current amount in budget 2019 is, and it's important to note, significant. On C92, I respect the views. I understand the objections, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, on the beliefs that the legislation and the objections to it, particularly as it relates to the interaction with the province. The relationship with Manitoba, I know, is different than from other provinces. It isn't by any stretch of the imagination, in my mind, unique, but we believe that the situation and the clauses that exist within the legislation should serve to allay that fear to a large extent. And again, as you mentioned, first and foremost, with I think the seamless thread in a lot of your interventions was funding, and I will take that back to Minister Bennett. And finally, a note on S3, and having canvassed a number of communities, I do understand that a lot of the burden of implementing S3 falls on Indigenous communities. It addresses a very specific piece of response to a Supreme Court judgment. In a lot of cases in this portfolio, you're catching up to the Supreme Court. and for a lot of people, reclaiming their identity is key. Key on a number of levels, but the burden of implementing this and as it relates to membership codes is quite intricate, and I don't think that it simply putting in place the fix to an act itself, which is imperfect, is the be all and end all. And let me reaffirm this, that Ottawa is not in the business of telling people who are Indigenous, only Indigenous communities can say that. But S3 was an attempt to right a historical wrong and catch up with the Supreme Court judgment that we believe fixing that will address a historical wrong. But I do thank you for your words, and if I don't answer all of the points you raised, I apologize, and I will raise them with the Minister when I get the opportunity.
Who is first? Okay, microphone 9, Chief Moody.
Good morning, Chief Moody, Siswasi Cree Nation. I know, Mr. Miller, I find you, based on listening to you, I find you to be really genuine, and I think you're a man of integrity. But you talk about creating 2 new departments to serve Aboriginal people, Aboriginal people better, and NCN has been in discussions with ISC on self-government negotiations, and we've drafted our MOU and we're moving forward. But it seems as though there's a disconnect somewhere. I've been reaching out to Joe Wild and Carl, people involved at the senior bureaucratic level, and these people are not even returning our calls. We have a draft MOU. There are some issues there, but the policy people and the negotiators, there seems to be a disconnect there somehow, and we've been waiting for a number of months to get some responses to the issues we raise, but these people don't seem to be responding to our calls. And so it's really, really frustrating. I think we've done our part in terms of the negotiations, in terms of the whole process and complying with the processes and trying to make things work for our community. But it seems to be frustrating. And when you say we're trying to, serve our Aboriginal people better, it seems to be contrary to what you're saying. And it's really a frustrating process. And also, another matter is this fiber optic build. It seems as though ISET is, pushing for private investors to be part of this build. We think we can do the project ourselves. We're self-determining. We think we can do the project ourselves, and I know that whole project has been on hold, for a number of years. The bill should have been completed already. And so, that needs to be addressed somehow or another, because, internet service and remote communities is so important. Everything that you do is relied on the ability to have, internet service for our people. Everything that you do, like billing, paying bills, and communicating to the world, it's so frustrating that this day and age everybody should have access to reliable internet service, or even Nelson knows. We're only an hour away from Thompson. Our internet service is so unreliable, it's so frustrating. It seems as though the world stops when the service is interrupted. Can you imagine how other First Nations that are remote feel? Because really they have no access to those services. So I think somehow or another, that whole file with ISET needs to be resolved, quickly, so we can proceed with the fiber build for our nations. Okay, thank you.
Chief, thank you very much. You're absolutely right on internet infrastructure. It's something we hear around the country. It's very difficult in Indigenous communities that are remote. the extra cost just skyrockets as a result, and the intricacies that are related to it. But there's no reason why you shouldn't. And so this is something we've committed to invest massively in rural infrastructure. Closing gaps, closing the easy gaps are easy, and closing the hard ones are harder. And it shouldn't be that Indigenous communities are disproportionately affected by the simple fact that of remoteness. I've seen even non-remote where it makes no sense. So I do agree with you. I'll raise this with Minister Jordan, who is the rural minister, but also with my team. And with respect to Joe, I'll make sure that he's aware of that, of the progress and the lack of response on your MOU, and I'll ask him to get back to you. Thank you.
The Terminator. Microphone number 8.
Good morning. David Morias, Chief of the Nation for Pimichigmag, Cross Lake First Nation. First of all, I just want to say that Pimichigmag is a sovereign nation. We will always maintain that we are self-governed, and that we have a treaty with the government, with the Crown, and represented by Canada. And we would like to see that any funding or any arrangements that are made with our nation be based on that treaty. And that any programs that are being made should be treaty-based, based on treaties. That's what we like to enter into, by implementing these treaties. And I think that would be the way to go to the funding if you're making changes. I know that Carolyn Bennett had stated she was no longer pursuing the two policies with respect to self-government and inherent right. And I think as a nation, we're not opposed to entering into government-to-government relations on any agreements, whatever bill that you seem to pass.